and we'll officially get started with the record button. Welcome, everybody. Excited to have you all in class today. My name is Curry Sotner. I'm the Chief Learning Officer at the National Constitution Center. And today's class is all about the amendments to the Constitution. There's 27 of them, but we would love to hear what's your favorite amendment. Feel free to share that in the chat, or what you think the 28th Amendment should actually be. So feel free to share that in the chat as the class goes on, along with any of the questions that you have. Now, to go through all of these amendments, we have one of our top scholars at the National Constitution Center with us today, Tom Donnelly. So Tom, we have had caffeine or sugar, and we are ready to run through this. So we know we always have lots of questions about the amendments and the effects that they have on the original or structural Constitution and we the people. But maybe when we think about these questions that we dive into, we should really start with, if we want to add that 28th Amendment, can you tell us how we could possibly make it happen?
Absolutely. So it's a very difficult process. And so this was by design by the founding generation. They wanted us to be able to change the Constitution over time as we learn new lessons. They didn't think they had a monopoly on constitutional wisdom, but they wanted the process to be hard. And as a result, they really made it difficult. You had to get more than majority support in different places to amend the Constitution. There's two big steps here. There's a proposal phase and a ratification phase. So beginning with the proposal, there are two ways that you could propose a new amendment. One is if you can get the support of 2/3 members of both houses of Congress. So a 2/3 vote in the US House and a 2/3 vote in the US Senate. You could see already there in modern politics, you'd probably have to get support of both parties to support an amendment, and that's only to get it proposed. The other mechanism is that you could also, through 2/3 of the states, propose a new convention for proposing amendments. Now, every amendment that we have in the Constitution, all 27 of them, came through that first proposal phase through Congress. But you can see there are two phases, there are two ways, one from Congress and one bubbling up from the states. The other part of the amendment process is ratification. So if you get your 2/3 vote in the House, 2/3 vote in the Senate, that's not the end of the process. Your amendment is then sent to the states for ratification, and Congress gets to determine whether ratification happens through state legislatures or specially called state ratifying conventions. But either way, you have to then get 3/4 of the states to support your amendment. So it's a massively high threshold. The theory behind it is that we want to have amendments to the Constitution sometimes, but we want them to have broad support with the idea that, those are going to be the amendments that are most likely good ideas that are going to improve the Constitution because they've been able to get support from a broad swath of the American people.
Awesome. So our work is cut out, and we should definitely, if we want to propose a 28th Amendment, look for broad support across all party lines and kind of like all organizational levels. So when we think about it, it's only happened 27 times, and that's not a lot. But what I love this next slide and what you've done for us is it kind of like broke it into groups and said, okay, these came in this bucket, these came in this bucket. So walk us through the big groupings of these amendments, and then we'll dive into how they affect the Constitution, and then go 1 through 27 in all of 27 minutes with questions, Tom, with questions.
Exactly. So you can see there are 4 big periods here. And so what's one of the really interesting things when you break it down this way is you could say we have 12 amendments added right there in the founding period itself. So we create this new Constitution, and one of the first things we do is we start tinkering with it. So this is where we get the Bill of Rights and 2 other amendments. And then we have another 60 years until we get the 13th Amendment. And so we have 3 new amendments during Reconstruction, that period after the Civil War, the 13th, 14th, and 15th, that many scholars refer to as America's second founding. And then, Curry, we have another 40+ year gap until we get the 16th Amendment. And so during the Progressive Era, 1913 to 1920, we get amendments 16, 17, 18, and 19. And then finally, we give, this last era is like the sort of modern era. It gives us 1933 to 1992. But it gives you an idea that sort of little by little, every few years, we would add some additional amendments. And so that's where we get the final 8 amendments to the Constitution.
I swear next time we do this class, I'm just going to stamp SORTA over the word modern because it drives us both nuts every time. And so when we think about this, we think about like how these amendments transform and change the Constitution. So we'll start with the founding period and look at, probably the amendments people know the most are the first 10 amendments, part of this founding era 12. And what did they do? So they just finished writing the Constitution, and then they add 10 really quickly. That's kind of crazy. So what do they ensure that the Constitution has in this first grouping?
Yeah, so it's so interesting. You're right. So one of the first things we do in the first Congress is propose these amendments to the Constitution, and it's not as though they came out of nowhere. So it's James Madison sitting in the U.S. House of Representatives that takes up the laboring oar of writing these amendments, but they emerge from the debates over the ratification of the Constitution itself, between the Federalists supporting the Constitution, the Anti-Federalists opposing it. Well, those who oppose the Constitution, one of their main criticisms of the document was that it didn't have a Bill of Rights. And so as part of the ratification process, the supporters of the Constitution told their anti-Federalist opponents, okay, we hear your concerns, we've learned from you, and we promise that once the Constitution is ratified, we're going to make it better. We're going to put in there a Bill of Rights. And so James Madison himself was skeptical that a Bill of Rights was necessary, but he learned from the ratification process. And furthermore, he knew that a Bill of Rights was going to be really important to binding the wounds of the nation around ratification. It was going to bring those people who oppose the Constitution into the fold, support the new Constitution, to understand the new government heard them, and hopefully the American project would work. And so that's how we get those first 10 amendments to the Constitution, the Bill of Rights.
And that's amazing to think about it. Like, we always forget the ratification was, in a way, was tearing apart a little bit of the country, and that this is a compromise to bring everybody back together and saying, we got a little bit about what you wanted, and we're going to put the Bill of Rights in because you're right, and we'll get a little bit about what you want back into this Constitution. Now, the groupings within that 10, we have sub groupings again, and I love this. Take those Bill of Rights and group them again into smaller buckets.
Yeah, so we're borrowing these groupings from our great friend Yale's Akhil Reed Amar. This is how he teaches the Bill of Rights. And it's a good way, I think, to think about how these amendments sort of fit together and work together to cohere into a bigger vision. Should we start with the First Amendment and the freedom of conscience?
Always. It's a big one within itself.
Yeah, so the First Amendment, in a way, is its own bundle of rights, because within it we get religious liberty, we get free speech, a free press, the right to assemble, and the right to petition your government for a redress of grievances. So just quickly ticking through those 5 categories, we see here with the First Amendment, it protects religious liberty in 2 ways. First, it guards against government establishing religion. And second, it protects the free exercise of religion. So in those 2 ways, promotes the freedom of conscience, the right to believe or not as we wish. So that's religion. We also know that we have key protections for free speech and a free press. And so this means that the government, generally speaking, can't punish you for what you write or what you say. And generally speaking, the Supreme Court itself protects speech unless it's likely to cause imminent lawless action. So if we're looking at free speech and a free press today, the Supreme Court protects these rights more fully, more robustly than at any time in our entire history. At the same time, even these rights have limits. So there are areas where governments have more authority to regulate speech. For instance, when there's a special relationship between the speaker and the government, and a classic example would be within public schools. So that's religion and speech.
Awesome. And I love this idea of back to like this, they group together as this freedom of your brain, your thought, your ideas, your friends, that freedom of conscience to do and talk and share ideas. Now, the second grouping groups the military amendment. So the Second Amendment and the Third Amendment.
Absolutely. And actually, just to get the last part of the First Amendment out there, we also have assembly and petition, which are 2 really important rights.
You had them.
Yeah, no, that we don't end up thinking about as much today, but these rights are really important to minority groups, often those without political power, allowing them to gather together to share their ideas, and then eventually to use the petition power to send those ideas to the government. So that's the end of the First Amendment, Curry.
Yeah, gathering together. Yeah, sorry, I thought you were there. Gathering together as a group and discussing, and then talking to your government and being loud about it in a way that makes good change and good idea sharing. So military amendments. Now we go to the Second and Third Amendment.
Yeah, so both of these amendments have to do with the founding generation's fear of professional soldiers. And so the Second Amendment for the founding generation, it went to early concerns about standing armies and the value of rooting your community's safety in a well-regulated, citizen-led, citizen-filled militia. Also through the Supreme Court and decisions like Heller and McDonald, we now recognize the Second Amendment as protecting an individual right to keep and bear arms for purposes of protecting your home. That's the Second Amendment. The Third Amendment, though, speaks to the American colonists' own lived experience. it talks about whether or not, it says that we can't be required to quarter, in other words, house soldiers in our own homes. And you may think this is a weird thing to have in the Bill of Rights, but it emerges from the American colonists' lived experience. The British, under the British Quartering Act of 1774, forced this upon the colonists. And so they wanted to make sure under this new constitution, this new national government wouldn't force Americans to do the same.
Awesome. And then next on our lineup, we look at the Fourth and the Fifth Amendments and kind of group this around privacy and property rights.
Absolutely. And so beginning with the Fourth Amendment, this is the amendment that regulates our relations with often police officers. And so it protects us from the government unreasonably searching and seizing various things, our persons, houses, papers, and effects. And so the protection here is against unreasonable searches and seizures by the government. The bottom line is that before the government can search your home, seize your property, it needs a good reason. And so this is also the justification for something like requiring police officers generally to get a warrant before conducting searches or seizures.
And the Fifth Amendment?
The Fifth Amendment speaks to the founding generation's commitment to property rights. Here, what we're talking about here is that last part of the amendment where you could see, shall private property be taken for public use without just compensation? So this says that if the government wants to take your property, seize your home, something like that, the government has to pay you a fair price for it.
And what's that clause called exactly?
It's called the Takings Clause.
Which I remember first learning about that and thinking it was something much more, and it's literally like taking, like literally like much more direct than you realize. Now we dive into, pulling the Fifth over into this grouping as well. So it teeters on both groupings. And this grouping looks at fair process, jury rights, and the rights of the accused, and looks at the Fifth, Sixth, Seventh, and Eighth Amendments.
Yeah, so the Fifth Amendment, the rest of the Fifth Amendment speaks broadly to the rights of the accused. So it grants criminal defendants a right against self-incrimination. So this is the right to remain silent you hear with the Miranda rulings, or when you hear people say, I plead the Fifth, what they're pleading is the Fifth Amendment. But you see other key protections here, like the protection not to be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, which speaks to broad procedural fairness. And so with the Fifth Amendment, you could see the beginning of the Bill of Rights speaking again to the rights of the accused, which then blends into the Sixth Amendment, which gives criminal defendants even more rights, like the right to a jury trial in criminal cases, a right to a lawyer, the right to be informed of what the government is accusing you of, and the Confrontation Clause, which gives you a right to cross-examine witnesses against you.
Awesome. Now we jump into the Seventh Amendment that talks about, rules of common law and the right of a trial by jury.
Yeah, so the Seventh Amendment responds to one of the anti-federalist main concerns, which is that the national government wasn't forced to hold jury trials in what are called civil cases. So this is just the right to a jury trial in certain non-criminal cases. That's what they mean by civil cases, non-criminal cases. So it's, again, a broader expansion of the right to a jury trial.
And then we dive into the Eighth Amendment, which is most middle school students' favorite amendment to talk about.
Yeah, so the Eighth Amendment bans excessive fines, excessive bail, and cruel and unusual punishment. And so this is the amendment that often is dealing with death penalty cases. That's where you may see it a lot of the time. And it spoke to the founding generation, and especially those anti-federalists, those who opposed the Constitution, feared this distant national government might invent new crimes or impose really harsh penalties, often to suppress political dissenters. And so the Eighth Amendment was designed to avoid that problem.
So Tom, and real quick sidebar. So when we were having a conversation about the Declaration of Independence and the grievances, now some of the colonists were sent all the way back to Britain to be heard by a group of Englishmen about their crimes from a country that they were really a colony, a continent that they weren't a part of. And so does this kind of spur from some of those original grievances and worry about a distant government accusing you and punishing you and you had no connection to them?
Well, it's that, and that's also where the jury rights, obviously, that coming in too. Juries were seen as a popular protection. If you're going to be convicted, you need to be convicted beyond, with a jury of your peers in mind. This language also, we derive it from one of the earliest Bills of Rights in the United States, the Virginia Declaration of Rights. So the Virginia Bill of Rights, we get some of this language from there, authored by Virginia's George Mason.
Awesome. So I love when we look at this document, we have to really understand that, you know, it's coming from somewhere, coming from other written documents. It's coming from experiences of the colonists, and they're weaving it into, you know, this listing of how our government's going to work so we don't have these issues again, and we ensure that people are kept safe and free. Now, the next two, I always think of like as the catch-all amendments, the 9th and 10th Amendments of the Bill of Rights, popular sovereignty and states' rights.
Yes, popular sovereignty means power being rooted in we the people. And the 9th Amendment is interpreted by many scholars to write certain natural rights in the Constitution. So it's meant as a cautionary note of sorts, where it tells us that just because there are certain rights that are not included in the Bill of Rights doesn't mean that you don't have them. It goes to the idea that the rights that we as a people have are way broader than you could ever put on a piece of paper. So if you read the Bill of Rights as including every right that we have as people, you're reading it the wrong way. And so this responds to the concerns. This is one of James Madison's big concerns, that if I start writing down the rights, I'm not going to get them all down there. And even if I write certain ones down, maybe I'm not expressing them as broadly as they really are felt and lived. And so the 9th Amendment goes to those concerns. The 10th Amendment speaks to the powers that are reserved to the states and to the people. And so before we had a new US Constitution, the states had really, really broad powers. And the states were seen as the governments that were closest to the people. So the states were really seen as expressing the views of the people in a really closely related way. And the 10th Amendment was all about recognizing the great amount of power that remained in the states. It honors our constitutional system's commitment to federalism, which is that some power is going to go to the national government, but a lot of power is going to go to the states.
And the states, like you said, as representatives of the people, even closer than this big national government. Now, and which Colin pointed out earlier, that like you see this shift between the Bill of Rights and the Reconstruction Amendments about, you know, who's the protector of we the people. And so we'll just nod to that, Colin. Great observation, and we'll get into that a little bit later when we get to 13th. So what happened? What's the backstory on the 11th Amendment? Why did they add this in? What was going on?
Yeah, so this is added 4 years after the Bill of Rights. So really, really quickly, it's ratified really, really quickly as well. It's ratified in 7 months. And this amendment it's one of the various amendments that we ratified that were meant to tell the Supreme Court they were wrong. So there was a decision, Chisholm versus Georgia, which had to do with whether or not ordinary citizens could sue the states for various things. And the Supreme Court said yes. And then we, the people, through the 11th Amendment said no. And so the 11th Amendment is about protecting what's called state sovereign immunity, which is the state's ability to not be sued by ordinary citizens.
Awesome. And I love that, again, nodding to checks and balances and separation of powers, and the people putting it into the Constitution can tell the Supreme Court no, so that's a check on the court. Now, the 12th Amendment is probably the favorite backstory of the day. Why did we have a 12th Amendment? What was going on?
Yeah, so the 12th Amendment adjusts the Electoral College. So again, it's very shortly after the U.S. Constitution's ratified. We decided the Electoral College wasn't quite written in as clear and as good a way as we needed it to be. So we used the 12th Amendment to change it. Under the original Constitution, electors cast ballots for not one, but 2 candidates for president. And the person who comes in first place becomes president. The person who comes in second place becomes vice president. When George Washington's running for president the first 2 elections, no problem. George Washington easily won. John Adams was easily in second place. It worked perfectly fine. But we saw even by 1796, as early as that, we see the emergence of political parties. The founding generation didn't think we'd have them, but very quickly we saw that they were developing, with Thomas Jefferson running against John Adams. Thomas Jefferson affiliated with the Democratic Republicans, John Adams with the Federalists. And so they have these 2 heated elections. John Adams wins the first one, but Thomas Jefferson finished in second place. So he becomes the vice president of his political rival, John Adams. This would be like Donald Trump being the vice president of Joe Biden, or Hillary Clinton of Donald Trump. You can imagine this may not work as well as you'd want within an administration. But then on the flip side, Thomas Jefferson runs again against John Adams 4 years later in the election of 1800. This time, Thomas Jefferson defeats John Adams, but because the Electoral College gave each elector 2 votes, Thomas Jefferson actually tied his running mate, Aaron Burr. And so the Electoral College itself didn't settle the election. Aaron Burr, rather than standing aside for Thomas Jefferson, who everyone knew was heading the ticket, said, hey, under the rules, I can win. And so the election goes to the House of Representatives. There are like tons of ballots around it. There's a deadlock. Eventually, there's a breakthrough. Thomas Jefferson wins, and we have a peaceful transition of power from John Adams to Thomas Jefferson, which is an important constitutional precedent. We went from one party to another peacefully, but we also decided very quickly, no, we need to change the Electoral College. The 12th Amendment still gives electors 2 votes, but under the 12th Amendment, 1 vote specifically goes for president and 1 vote specifically goes for vice president.
Awesome. Always a fun storyline. Now we jump almost 60 years, a little more than 60 years later to the Reconstruction time period. So end of the Civil War. And this is where we see this shift in the federal government, and we see 3 amendments come out that kind of rebalances the power in the Constitution for Congress and for the federal government to take action on these amendments. So tell us a little bit about the Reconstruction time period. I love this lithograph that we can do to look at that moment, and then we'll dive into the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment.
Yeah, so this is the period after the Civil War, and the Republican Party, the party of Lincoln, is trying to figure out how do we need to change the Constitution to set better constitutional baselines after the Civil War to make sure, especially that we could give a new birth of freedom, as Lincoln promised at Gettysburg, to African Americans. And so we ratify a series of 3 transformational amendments. The first one, the 13th Amendment, ratified in 1865, and it abolishes slavery. The second of them is the 14th Amendment, ratified in 1868, and it wrote the Declaration of Independence's promise of freedom and equality into the Constitution. And then finally, the 15th Amendment, ratified in 1870, promised to end racial discrimination in voting. And so all of these amendments together are meant to expand equal citizenship, promises of freedom, equality, and for African American men, the right to vote.
Awesome. Now, the next grouping is the Progressive era. So 1913 to 1920, again, short period of time here. And we have amendments 16 through 19 kind of come through. So let's dive into the 16th Amendment.
Yeah, so the 16th Amendment, ratified in 1913, gave Congress the power to pass an income tax. And so this is another amendment that's a response to a Supreme Court decision. In 1895, in a case called Pollock, the Supreme Court struck down a federal income tax. This led to great agitation against the Supreme Court and in support of an income tax by the populist movement, by the progressive movement, and eventually this culminates in 1913 in the 16th Amendment.
The 17th Amendment?
17th Amendment, ratified the same year in 1913, and it provides for the direct election of senators. So under the original Constitution, senators are selected by state legislatures. With the 17th Amendment, we say, no, 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 we think the voters should select state senators. 2 big reasons. One, the direct election of senators is consistent with broader trends towards greater democracy in the United States. So the 17th Amendment was of a piece with that. The other is that some reformers charged that state legislatures were selling some Senate seats in backroom deals. And so there's allegations of corruption.
It always blows my mind that we did not vote for senators before 1913. It feels like such a short time period ago. Now, I'm actually going to add an amendment to our lineup in this grouping, because when you do the 18th Amendment, I don't think you can do the 18th Amendment without doing the 21st Amendment. So let's dive into both.
Yeah, so the 18th Amendment is the Prohibition Amendment. So it banned the manufacture, sale, or transportation of intoxicating liquors. We ratified it in 1919. And, in part, this ends up being a response to, what were serious concerns in America about alcohol use. Americans drank a lot. And that brought with it all sorts of societal problems. Salaries or wages drinking away at saloons, homes broken up. There were serious reasons why reformers were pushing for prohibition. The Prohibition Amendment itself brings together a variety of different movements: progressives, suffragists, populists, nativists, white Southerners. These reform movements didn't always go together or see eye to eye on a bunch of things, but when it came to prohibition, they did. And so they pushed the Prohibition Amendment into place, and it's ratified in 1919. It's in place for 13 years, and then we, the people, decide that was a lousy idea. And so the 18th Amendment becomes the only amendment that we repealed outright. And so what does the amendment say? It says the 18th article of amendment to the Constitution of the United States is hereby repealed. And so it's really direct. And this is just an example, again, of us experimenting with one amendment and then concluding just a little over a decade later, no, we don't want that in the Constitution anymore.
And the 21st Amendment was done by ratifying convention. It's the one anomaly. Is that correct?
Yes, so the 21st Amendment ratified in 1933 gets rid of prohibition. It's the only time we ratify through state, especially called state ratifying conventions. Every other amendment, the other 26, are ratified by state legislatures.
Fascinating. Okay, now we're back on track and let's take a look at the 19th Amendment. So it's a really important one. We just did a great, amazing tour of the 19th Amendment exhibit last night. So there's just so many amazing players we could talk about this.
Absolutely. So the 19th Amendment's ratified in 1920. And what it does is it writes the right to vote for women into the Constitution. And so this is an amendment that bubbles up originally from the states. We see women voting initially out west. And then over time, this proved to be a good idea. It expands to the east, including to big states like New York and Michigan. And eventually we conclude, wait, we want this to be a national rule. So we write it right into the Constitution. It's an example of the states being, as Justice Brandeis said, laboratories of democracy. And so we're learning from good things that states do and then turning them into a national rule.
Okay, now to the last category. I feel like a game show host. The modern-ish era. So 1933 to 1992. So it's a pretty big graph. We have 8 amendments. Let's begin with the 20th Amendment. Yeah,
so the 20th Amendment's ratified in 1933. What it was meant to do is to limit the amount of time between an election and when the new government takes over. And so it moved the date from March after the new election of the government taking over. It moved it up to January.
Awesome, pretty straightforward. We already talked about the 21st Amendment, and you can see the celebration there. And we'll jump into the 1951 and the 22nd Amendment.
The 22nd Amendment effectively limits presidents to 2 terms in office. It's a term limits amendment for the president. This arises from George Washington's own example. So he runs for president, wins re-election, and then says, I'm retiring to Mount Vernon. Every president until FDR does the same, does not break the George Washington precedent. FDR does. He's elected 4 separate times, and then we decide in 1951, no, we like the way George Washington did it better. We want that term limit in place.
Awesome. Now we jump into 1961, and we look at the 23rd Amendment. And that kind of brings us to the 23rd and the 24th. I always group those amendments together.
Yeah, so both of these, it's the civil rights era. And so 1961, the 23rd Amendment, what it does is it gives DC voters a voice in presidential elections. It gives the District of Columbia 3 electoral votes. How does this connect to the civil rights movement? Well, in part, the 23rd Amendment, by bringing Washington, DC into presidential elections, enfranchises a massive African-American population in the District of Columbia and gives them a voice in presidential elections.
And the 24th Amendment in 1964?
Sure, so the 24th Amendment bans poll taxes in national elections. So these are taxes that you would have to pay before you could vote. And so this was a device used, especially in the Jim Crow South, to keep African-Americans away from the polls. When this amendment is ratified, there are still 5 states that had poll taxes on the books. And so the 24th Amendment gets rid of them as to national elections. And then just 2 years later in 1966, the Supreme Court in a case called Harper versus Virginia Board of Elections would say, no, they can't apply in state or local elections either.
Now, I always find these next few, every amendment is connected to a backstory and history, but the 25th Amendment kind of give us the backstory and then why they added the amendment. And we'll look at the 26th in the same lens as well.
Sure. So it's 1967, 25th Amendment. It deals with the issue of presidential succession and incapacity. And so part of what's arising here is, people are starting to think seriously about this after the assassination of John F. Kennedy in 1963. And so the 25th Amendment deals with these problems in a few different ways. One, it makes it clear that when a president dies, resigns, or is removed, the vice president becomes president. 2, it gives us a mechanism for selecting a vice president. And that's Section 2. Section 3 deals with the problem of what if a president is just temporarily incapacitated? So say they need to go under anesthesia to get some sort of procedure done. What can we do? Well, the 3rd section of the 25th Amendment says the president can sign a piece of paper, then the vice president becomes president. And then when the president comes out, sign another piece of paper and becomes president again. Finally, Section 4 deals with the problem of what if a president is incapacitated in a way but doesn't recognize it themselves? It provides a mechanism for members of government to get that president temporarily removed from office to avoid that problem.
And the 26th Amendment is the fastest amendment. I love these two because they go opposite of each other, these last two. So the 26th Amendment is the fastest amendment to be ratified. What was happening that kind of stirred so much energy for adding this amendment? And what is the amendment about?
The 26th Amendment, it's ratified in 1971. It's ratified in a little over 3 months. So really, really quickly, this is the fastest amendment. What it does is it effectively sets a national voting age at 18. And so before the ratification of the 26th Amendment, most states set their voting age at 21. With the 26th Amendment, we say, no, we think it should be 18. Why? Well, this is taking place during the Vietnam War. And so many people reach the conclusion, if you are willing to sacrifice for your country at the age of 18, you should be able to vote too.
Awesome. And now to the slowest amendment process, the longest, the 27th Amendment. So this idea of this amendment, who did it spark from originally?
James Madison. So James Madison wrote this one. This amendment is the original, it would have been the original Second Amendment. It was proposed with the rest of the Bill of Rights, but it wasn't ratified at the time. It would only be ratified a little over 200 years later, and it was taken on, so it went from James Madison's pen to then the last work getting it ratified was, it was a student who was mad about getting a lousy grade on a college paper at the University of Texas. This is the person here, Gregory Watson. He received a C on a paper in his government class. He had to write about any sort of governmental process. And so he found a book that had lists of amendments that had never been ratified. He saw this amendment on that list and he thought, well, you know, there's no specific time limit in Article 5 into how long an amendment needs to be in place. There's no limit written into the amendment itself. So I'm going to get this thing ratified. You know, we could still get this thing ratified. And so he argues in his paper that that what became the 27th Amendment was the original Second Amendment could still be ratified because there's no time limit on when amendments can be ratified. Again, he gets a lousy grade. He gets a C on this paper. He protests. He says, no, this is a good paper. I should get a higher grade. Both his TA and his professors say, no, we think it's a lousy paper. And so what Gregory Watson then does is said, okay, you may not fix my grade, but I'm going to get this thing written into the Constitution. So it's a really unlikely story here, Curry. What the amendment itself deals with is that it limits Congress's power to give itself a raise. And so if Congress wants to give itself a raise, there has to be another election before that raise takes effect. So it's just seen as a way of, you know, Congress can give itself a raise, but it allows the voters to weigh in and say, was that a good idea or was that a bad idea as part of the next elections for Congress. And so what Gregory Watson does is he writes letters to a bunch of different state legislatures, to governors, to senators, you name it. And most people say nothing, but there is one powerful senator who says, this is actually a pretty good idea. It's Bill Cohen of Maine. And so Maine votes to ratify it. And then gradually over time, other states follow. Part of the reason, Curry, is that during this period of time, there's great dissatisfaction, disapproval of Congress. They maybe don't think that many Americans may not think Congress deserved the salary they were already getting. So in a way, the 27th Amendment dovetails with this general dissatisfaction with Congress until finally in 1992, over 2 centuries after the first Congress proposed the amendment to the states, 3/4 of the states ratified the 27th Amendment. So the 27th Amendment becomes part of the Constitution. It just took a little over 200 years.
And talk about waiting and biding your time until the right moment. Gregory Watson came around at the right moment. So Tom, when we think about what would the 28th Amendment be, and there was comments about income tax and ERA and a positive voting rights amendment. One of the things that you've kind of, when you analyze the 27 amendments that are in there, you've said to us before, sometimes it's taking our big ideas of what we believe we should be and adding them to the Constitution. And sometimes it's just clarifying and fixing almost like clerical errors in the Constitution. So what's the big ideas about constitutional amendments that our students should think about if they do want to pull a Gregory Watson, but add a completely new amendment to the system?
Well, yeah, I think just going through the amendments like this is a fun exercise. It gives us a sense that amendments can do, as you said, Curry, really big things. Like the Reconstruction Amendments, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, there's a reason people call them America's second founding. They make massive changes to the rights within the Constitution and the balance of power between the national government and the states. But then we have things like the 20th Amendment, where you wonder, how did that even get ratified? All it's doing is moving up the date of when the government's starting from March to January. So it seems to be a really little change. But either way, I think from all of these stories, what we learn is that one, any amendment's going to need to get really, really broad support. And so as a result of that, either it's going to have to be an idea that really has support in our day from both parties, or it has to be something, and related to that, it often has to respond to some sort of, whether it's a movement that's putting a new idea on the agenda, or just a deep-seated concern that people have about the nation. They're often going to respond to that. So it's either going to be a big thing like that, or sometimes, I wonder, like, how did the 20th Amendment get in? Like, it's just, it can sometimes be, if you have a good idea to make a small change that would seem to make the government better, sometimes that works too, because it doesn't seem so political, probably. So I would sort of leave it at that. But I guess the point is, there are many different pathways, there are many different kinds of amendments, but regardless, what you have to do is find an idea that's going to attract broad support, because that's the only way that it's going to be able to be added to the Constitution.
But also that the ability that it can change and it can be modified is also fascinating too. So Tom, thank you so much. That was really fun to go through all of them and then kind of almost like analyze it for the big ideas and the big picture that we should see at the same time too. So thank you all very much, Tom. That was fantastic. And if you have any questions, please let us know. Yes, there will be a recording and we'll send it out to everybody at the end of the week's wrap up. And it is also, thank you, Colin, it is on our YouTube channel. So everybody have a fantastic day. Happy Wednesday. And Tom, thank you so much. That was great.
Thank you. This is always a fun one.